was super curious. I think that's why his name's Curious George, right? He's just so curious about everything. Aiden.
He actually broke his leg and the people laughed at him for no reason. Kind of like when I was like knocking where you can put the drink on the grill, and then the guys that were building, I was serious out there.
Yeah.
Because I don't like people building houses right behind our house.
Yeah.
And I was serious and they're like, ha, 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 ha.
Yeah. So he got hurt and people laughed at him, which wasn't very nice. What else do you remember? Hunter.
And he went to the hospital.
He went to the hospital. Why did he go to the hospital? We read that one yesterday.
Because he broke his leg.
He broke his leg, but he went to the hospital for a different reason. Mahala.
He swallowed a puddle.
He swallowed a puzzle piece. And where else did he go? She said puzzle. He swallowed a puzzle piece. Brady. He went to school. So today we are going to read Curious George's dream. Read about his dream. You read this one?
Yeah.
No.
It's so scary.
This is George. George was a good little monkey and always very curious. After a long day at the amusement park with his friends, the man with the yellow hat, George was tired and glad to be home.
Oh yeah,
This time he is yellow. Our other book, we couldn't see that he was yellow. You see, he's got tons of hats.
Yeah, he got 3 of them.
Yeah, and then one on his head.
He got 4. One's on his head.
So dinner was ready, but when George sat down to eat, he was too small to reach his plate. "I'm sorry, George," the man said. "I forgot to fix your chair." He put a large book on George's chair, and George climbed up. As he sat on the book that was set on his chair, George thought about his day. All day long, he had been too small. Corinne, the eyes are up here. "Your hands are too little to hold these bunnies," the manager of the petting zoo told him. "I'm sorry," said the man operating the carousel. "I cannot let you on. You need a grown-up to ride with you." So we heard our first word, operating. What do you think the word operating means? Ariel.
It means like, what was I going to say? Like you're getting something ready, or like they say at the hospital.
So you're getting something ready and you operate at the hospital. That's good. Good job. What else? Can anybody else think of what it is? What about when you're operating a video game? What are you doing? Brady. You're turning it on. Are you playing?
Yeah.
Are you controlling it? Making sure everything's going well while you're playing?
Yes.
So the operator of the carousel makes sure that he stops the ride and he makes sure that it's running correctly when people are on.
That's another thing I was going to say. I just wanted to say one.
Okay, you just want to say one thing. "Maybe next year," said the man taking tickets at the roller coaster. Come on, Brogan. But after a good meal and a good dessert, George began to feel better. When the dishes were finished, the man said, "George, I have a surprise for you." And they went into the living room, Ethan and Hunter. The surprise was a movie. George was glad to watch a movie. That was something he was not too small to do. George was watching the movie, but it had been a full day, and now his stomach was full. Soon, he could not keep his eyes open. The next thing George knew,
He was asleep.
you think he fell asleep?
Yeah.
He had a long day, he was tired, and his stomach was full. He was back at the petting zoo, but this time something was different. The petting zoo was very small. In fact, everything was small. George looked around. Then he looked at himself. Maybe everything wasn't so small after all, he thought. Maybe he was... Anything happened to George? Raising your hand? Max.
Too big.
He's too big now? So you think he got bigger?
Yeah.
Mahala?
That he's swimming, because on the cover it said, "Curious George swim."
So Mahala remembered what our book was called. It was Curious George's Dream. So she thinks that he's dreaming that he's too big. Big. Uh-oh. That is not right, thought George. Then he remembered the bunnies. Why, he was not too small to hold a bunny now. He was not too small to do anything. What fun, George thought, and he went to the bunnies. Now George could hold lots of bunnies, and he cuddled them to his face. The bunnies liked George.
Is he real or is it just a dream? That's a dream. I think he's just inside of his dream. I think he's not dreaming because he ate so much food.
Think he's not dreaming? Oh, so he ate so much food that he got big. What?
No.
But the manager of the petting zoo did not. Put those bunnies down, she said. You'll scare them. You are too big. George didn't want to scare the bunnies. He put them down and turned to go. Then George saw the roller coaster. He was curious. Was he big enough to ride it now?
No. Way too big.
Way too big?
Yeah.
Of course he was big enough, if only he could find a seat big enough for him. But the man taking tickets made George leave. You cannot ride this ride, he said. You are too big. George was sad he could not ride, but he did as he was told.
You could just smash them.
But that's not nice. And George is a nice monkey. Catch that monkey, someone yelled as George was leaving the roller coaster. He's dangerous. People in the park became frightened. They began to run. Frightened. What does that word mean? Aiden,
I'll show you.
you gonna show us? That's how you can act when you're frightened. So you're running away, maybe screaming. Ethan, frightened. So Aiden showed us.
You're
You're
really scared.
really, really scared. So you think you'd be scared if you saw a giant monkey?
No, I know what I would do.
I'd be a little scared if I saw a giant monkey
I would
just
just
walking
ride
around.
it.
You would ride it.
I would be like, just like hey monkey.
You guys are brave compared to me. I'd be a little scared.
You know what I'll do? I'm not scared either.
We are not flirting. If you have something to say, you are raising your hand. Asher.
I think this is what frightened looks like. You could just be walking around, have a nice day, and then you can also faint when you're...
You could faint. You were so scared that you faint.
And you can also be speechless.
They began to run. They ran in all directions, but mostly they ran away from George. George felt awful. He didn't want to frighten anybody. If you're not looking at the book, you are not going to see what's happening.
What if you touch just standing there?
He just wanted to hide, but where could he go? He was too big to fit anywhere. Then George saw the carousels. He wouldn't need a grown-up to get him on this time. But this time, George wished he had a grown-up with him. He wished his friends were here. George sat on the carousel feeling lonely. Suddenly, someone called his name. George! George! It sounded like the man with the yellow hat. Could his friend be here to take him home? George heard his name again. Raising your hand. Who do you think's calling his name? Brady? Nope. The man with the yellow hat. Hunter, who do you think?
Someone that owns that camera, so he won't break the side thing.
So someone who owns the carousel, maybe the operator of it, so that way he doesn't break it. It was his friend. George wanted to jump into his friend's arms, but the man with the yellow hat was too small. How could he ever take George home now? The man called his name again. George, he said, wake up. It's time for bed. You fell asleep watching the movie. George looked at his friend. Why, he wasn't small after all. George looked at himself. He was not big. Now George could climb into his friend's arms, and that is what he did.
He was just like...
Hold on. As the man with the yellow hat tucked him in, George was happy to be in his little bed. It was not very big, he thought, but he fit in it perfectly. George was just the right size.
So he did dream.
So it was a dream, just like Mahala figured out from our title, Curious George's Dream. So raising your hand, who can remember our word operating?
sure it's safe and okay.
Making sure it's safe and okay. Hunter.
I really think it means.
Remember we had the operator of the carousel who were operating the video game?
Oh, I remember what they do. They control the thing so anyone won't fly off or get hurt.
So they make sure that the machine's running well. Am I going to look for that book in the or that word in the beginning, middle, or end?
Middle.
So operating. And what letter am I going to look for?
Oh.
An O. I'm looking at this one first. Operating. So an operating is the act, process, or way of operating. So an operator, so like we saw the man who was working the carousel, a person who operates a machine or other device. So it's someone who runs something or owns something. And what about frightening? Ethan.
It means they're supposed to find things.
Remember they were frightened of George when he was big. And Aiden showed us what it looked like. Do you want to think about it?
Yeah.
No, you know it? Frightening.
Put the time and then when you see something scary, you just run away.
So you see something really scary and you might run away. Okay. Aiden, you're going to show us it. Yeah, you might run, you might scream. You look pretty scared. And Asher.
It's like, you could be like this. You could be just have a nice day then.
You could fake too. So am I going to look for my word in the beginning, middle, or end of our dictionary?
But
Frightening. Frightening. Beginning, middle, or end?
Beginning.
At the beginning. And what letter?
F.
So frightened. To make or become afraid. Just like Aiden showed us. So you can run and you can scream when you're frightened. You could faint like Asher. You could cry. So you're just really, really scared.
You could fall down.
You could fall down.
You could face plant.
So let's all turn our bodies. Here's our word wall.
Yeah, but what about the phone? You look like that. Now we can see the phone.
Thank you, Sierra.